It's another rainy winter's morning, and I thought today I would show you these. These are the sort of drawings I've been doing for no particular reason, which I think characterises so much of my work. And they're slightly dreamy drawings featuring a floating figure and a floating rock, and then lots of cross-hatching, just to sort of build up texture. It's a very enjoyable thing to do. I call it knitting, and there is a sort of sense that these drawings are unknitted. And again, you know, sort of slightly dreamy figure with a sort of rock floating in the background. And I'm just going to, today on this rainy morning, just spend, if you will indulge me, a little time knitting. I quite like the sound it makes. And it's a sort of patient activity. Slowly building up texture. One of the great masters of this was Aubrey Beardsley. Could create amazing tonal and decorative textures with ink line. And of course the American illustrator and stage designer Edward Gorey is another great master of the crosshatch. I like it because it's not as definitive as painted black. You know, a solid sheet of sort of black ink applied with a paintbrush. This is feathery. You can build up very dark areas depending on how dense the hatching is, but even the dark areas have a certain shimmer to them because you're not applying a solid black. And I think that creates the slightly often spooky atmosphere that you can build up with cross-hatching. The great master I suppose, historical master, as opposed to contemporary illustrators, was Rembrandt, with his etchings. And they're always worth looking at, just to see his mastery of both line and tone, and the way that he could build up a really textured quality in his work through layerings of shading, hatched shading. And I always used to think that his etchings were sort of like modern etchings, you know, quite large, maybe, you know, A3, possibly A4, maybe. But in fact, a lot of Rembrandt's etchings, certainly the ones he did for himself, are tiny. He did a series of self-portraits that are no bigger than a postage stamp. And that was because if he was just doing it as an experiment for himself, copper, which is used in the as the plate for etching, was so expensive that you simply didn't, unless you had a prestigious commission, you didn't use large amounts of copper. You would cut down your copper plates to make them go further, and so you would work on a very, very small scale. And when I went to Rembrandt's house in Amsterdam, and I thoroughly recommend it if you go to Amsterdam, which is a marvellous city. I think one of my favourite cities of sort of Northern Europe. if you visit Rembrandt's house, you can see these etchings, and they are absolutely tiny, and you have to peer into them, and yet the detail is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. He did a series of self-portraits to explore facial expressions, look of anger, look of surprise, half turning away, those sort of things, and they're tiny little postage stamp etchings, and yet they are so evocative. And for many years I had a reproduction on my studio wall. I'd found it in a magazine and just photocopied it, so it's and enlarged it, so it was large. So I lived with this amazing etching as a sort of A3 print, and I was aware that I had enlarged it, but I wasn't aware of how tiny the original was because I'd found the reproduction in a magazine. So no, absolutely fascinating. And talking about masters of crosshatch, I can't not mention the great Sir John Tenniel, illustrator of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. And I had the privilege, again many years ago, to be allowed into what can only be described as the vaults of Macmillan, who is my publisher and was the original publisher of Alice in Wonderland. And they had in their vaults, in their offices in London, they've since moved, but back then they were just on the corners of Victoria and Belgravia. And I was ushered into this vaulted room, and I had to put on white gloves, and I was shown the wood engravings of the Alice illustrations done by John Tenniel and the Dial brothers, who were the engravers. So Tenniel would actually draw his illustration that would then be stuck onto the woodblock and then transferred onto the woodblock by hand, a sort of almost tracing process, which destroyed the original drawing in the process as it was transferred onto the block of wood. And then the Dial brothers, two of them, they would sit down and just painstakingly etch the lines that Tenniel had indicated in his original drawing. So there aren't any original Tenniel drawings. They are all transferred onto the woodblock, destroyed in the process, and so in a sense the originals are the woodblock engravings. And they are beautiful, beautiful to hold these engravings in your hand and look at these familiar images etched in the finest detail. Wonderful, wonderful objects. And I suppose in some ways, Tenniel's experience of having his illustrations destroyed in order to reproduce them, is analogous to digital art today, when artists produce their work entirely as digital files, so they don't exist on paper unless, of course, they are printed out. So they, in a sense, their digital files are the equivalent of Tenniel's woodblocks. And in order then to sort of go out into the world, they are printed. So no original drawings necessarily exist if you're a digital artist. And it's something I don't regret, in a sense, not going fully digital, because it means I accumulate and have accumulated over my career an enormous number of original drawings and original pieces of artwork. And from time to time, as you see me here, I will draw something just for the pleasure of it, and then it exists as a unique and personal drawing that I can then sell if I want to. So it's, which is, I think, what I will do with these drawings. I will put them on my Cycling Fish Big Cartel site and maybe sell them next week. And I like the idea of them going out into the world, being owned by people, being put on the wall, because in a sense that's what they're for. They are original pieces. They're not necessarily illustrating long-form narrative. They don't form they don't necessarily belong in a book as such, because I've done them separately. They are just drawings done by an illustrator that are original, and there are no reproductions of them anywhere else, so you can own an original piece, which I always like the idea of. And I try not to inflate my prices too much, because I think it's important that, you know, they have some value, but they're not overpriced, because it's not for me to speculate, really. I mean, I think that's for, you know, future owners of work to decide what they think they're worth, not me. I like sending these drawings like messages in bottles out into the world, and I like the idea that they end up somewhere on people's walls, or maybe in albums of some sort. And sometime in the future, someone might come along and curate them and find out where they all went to and who owns them, and might wonder about the conditions and time in which I did them, just as I, in my turn, have wondered about Rembrandt and how he lived and what the conditions were like in Amsterdam when he lived in the house I visited. There's something fantastic about being able to see someone's drawings from many hundreds of years ago and imagine what it must be like to be that person, and to what was going through that person's mind as they made art. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Rembrandt had a Patreon page and he could pontificate as he created his marvellous etchings? I would certainly be a patron.